Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book, Season 2. We're covering an introduction to criminological theory by Roger Hopkins Burke. In Episode 8, we explore how female criminality has been understood and misunderstood through the lens of classical positivist theories.
That's right. And it's quite striking when you look back. For a very long time in criminology's history, female criminal behavior was, well, it was really pushed to the side, just neglected.
Neglected? Why was that? I mean, what was the official line, the justification for not really looking into it?
Well, the main stated justification really came down to the numbers, or the perceived numbers anyway. Female involvement in crime just seemed so much lower than male involvement.
So the thinking was, if women aren't committing much crime, why spend a lot of time studying the few who do?
Exactly. The underlying assumption was that women are, fundamentally law-abiding for the most part.
Okay, let's unpack those numbers a bit, because the source gives some really specific statistics that were used to back up that perception.
It does. For instance, data mentioned, like from Coleman and Moynihan back in '96, looking historically, showed that by the time people reached age 28, about 33% of males had picked up a conviction for a serious offense. But for females, only around 6%.
33% versus 6%. That's a massive difference.
It really is. And the source emphasizes this isn't just a recent thing. That kind of ratio, that huge gap, has actually stayed pretty similar over many, many years.
And does that hold true even for crimes maybe stereotypically associated with women, like shoplifting?
You'd think maybe not, but yeah. The source notes that even for shoplifting, official conviction statistics actually show more males are convicted than females.
Huh?
And if you look at serious crimes overall, say in Britain, something like 80% of those convicted are male.
80%.
And women make up just a tiny fraction of the prison population, around 3% in Britain. And you find very similar, very skewed ratios in the U.S. as well.
Wow. So the official data really seem to paint a picture of crime as, well, overwhelmingly a male issue, historically speaking.
That was definitely the perception reinforced by the numbers.
So our mission in this deep dive, then, is to really get into the explanations that did emerge for female crime, specifically within that early positivist framework. The source calls it the predestined actor model, right?
Exactly. That model assumes behavior, including crime, is determined by factors sort of outside an individual's conscious control, biological, psychological, or social forces.
So we're going to look at how those early biological, psychological, and sociological positivists tried to explain the female crime that did exist.
And critically, we need to examine the assumptions they're making about women's fundamental nature. Assumptions that, as we'll see, were often pretty questionable, even for their time.
Right. Let's jump straight into the biological side of things then.
Yeah.
And the first name that always comes up is Cesar Lombroso.
Lombroso, yes. Especially his work, The Female Offender, which he wrote with his son-in-law Ferrero, published around 1885. His whole approach is rooted in biological determinism.
The idea that your biology basically dictates who you are and what you do.
That's the core of it. Biology as destiny, including criminal destiny. Now, it's crucial to say up front, his methods and conclusions are, well, they're widely seen today as deeply flawed, scientifically unsound, and frankly, pretty sexist.
It's credited now, yeah.
Absolutely. But the source makes a really important point. Even though Lombroso himself is discredited, his underlying assumptions about the basic physiological and psychological nature of women, well, they actually cast a really long shadow.
How so?
Later writers, even those moving into psychological or sociological territory, people like W.I. Thomas, Kingsley Davis, Otto Pollack, we'll discuss later, many of them, implicitly or sometimes explicitly, were still relying on Lombroso's foundational ideas about what women were fundamentally like.
So his biased ideas kind of seeped into later work, even if it wasn't purely biological.
That's the argument, yes. The ghost of Lombroso lingered.
Okay, so what was his core idea about crime itself? This concept of atavism.
Right, atavism. His central premise was that criminals were atavistic, essentially evolutionary throwbacks. People who, he believed, physically or mentally resembled earlier, more primitive stages of human evolution.
So crime wasn't a choice, it was a sign of being less evolved.
Exactly. It was an inherent characteristic for these individuals. His method involved comparing physical traits, skull measurements, facial features, hair patterns, that sort of thing. He'd compare convicted female criminals and prostitutes with women he considered normal.
And any traits common in the criminal group were labeled as atavistic.
Yes, those were the supposed signs of their primitive nature.
So what did he conclude about women specifically within this framework? This is where the biases really come through, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's quite revealing. Lombroso made this rather surprising argument, surprising to us now anyway, that women in general share many common traits because they exhibit fewer variations in their mental capacities compared to men.
Fewer variations, meaning women are more alike, more uniform than men.
That was exactly his claim. He and Ferrero wrote quite starkly in 1885 that even the female criminal is monotonous and uniform compared with her male companion, just as in general, woman is inferior to man.
Inferior and uniform? That's quite a starting point for a scientific theory.
It is, and they went even further, describing women as being atavistically nearer to her origin than the male.
Nearer her origin, what do they mean by that?
They meant closer to what they considered lower forms of less differentiated life. Basically less evolved, less complex.
So being less evolved and less varied, how did that explain crime rates? Because women commit less crime.
Exactly. And this is the twist in his logic. He used this perceived lack of variation, this supposed biological simplicity, to explain the lower rates of female crime. His conclusion was that normal women commit less crime precisely because they have fewer anomalies, fewer variations, less deviation from this supposed primitive female norm compared to men.
So conformity is a sign of being less developed in his view. That's completely counterintuitive today.
It really flips our modern understanding on its head, doesn't it? Their very lack of variability, their closeness to these lower forms, was the reason they were seen as naturally more conforming.
Okay. What about traits like passivity and conservatism? How did he explain those?
He saw those as inherent biologically rooted traits in women. He linked them partly to the traditional female sex role in the family, a more sedentary existence, preparing them for domesticity. But he also tried to give it a biological basis, even linking it to the nature of the sex act itself.
The sex act. How did that relate to passivity?
Well, the implication was that the female role in sex was inherently passive, and this biological passivity extended to their general character.
Right. And what about intelligence and passion? How did they fit into his picture of female crime?
This is another key part. Lombroso argued that most normal women were actually constrained from committing crime because they lacked sufficient intelligence and passion.
Lack of intelligence and passion prevents crime.
In his view, yes. He associated those qualities, intelligence and passion, with criminal women, and interestingly, with all men. So the average woman was seen as lacking the drive, the intellect, the spark that he thought was necessary for significant criminal behavior.
So this creates a very specific image of the female offender, then. She's an exception to female nature.
Absolutely. The female offender, in Lombroso's biologically determinist framework, is fundamentally masculine. She possesses those male traits of intelligence, passion, and variation that deviate from the female norm. The normal woman, conversely, is defined by her supposed femininity, passivity, uniformity, lack of passion.
And did he claim to find physical evidence for this masculinity in female offenders?
He did. He argued his physical examinations supported this. He claimed that skull measurements and other physical anomalies he found in female criminals were actually closer to those of men, whether normal or criminal men, than they were to normal women.
So their bodies supposedly looked more male.
In certain ways, yes. He often described female offenders as having a virile cranium or possessing considerable body hair. He interpreted these features not just as variations, but as biological anomalies, physical markers of this inherent masculine deviance.
So traits we might just see as diversity today were pathologized as signs of being unnaturally masculine and therefore criminal.
Precisely. It wasn't just difference. It was abnormality linked to criminality. And Lombroso and Ferrero added one more point in their 1885 work, arguing that women have an inherent lack of property sense, which also contributed to their specific forms of criminality.
Lack of property sense, meaning
Yep.
they didn't understand or value property in the same way men did.
That was their claim. Their reasoning was, well, quite something. They wrote that, for women, theft is an audacity for which compensation is due to the owner, as an individual rather than a social crime.
So like a personal transgression, not a violation of broader social rules about property.
Yes, exactly. They compared it to how theft was supposedly viewed in the primitive periods of human evolution and is still regarded by many uncivilized nations, framing female theft as rooted in a primitive, individualistic, pre-social understanding of property.
Again, linking female behavior to a supposedly less evolved state.
That's the recurring theme. But the source quickly brings in critiques, especially from feminist scholars like Shirley Klein in her 1973 work.
And what was Klein's take on this lack of property sense idea?
Klein fundamentally challenged the basic assumption, this idea that women inherently possess a different sense of property than men. She argued very strongly that if you observe any differences in how women historically related to property, it wasn't due to biology.
What was it due to then?
It had to be explained by social and economic factors, specifically the historical reality that women lacked property ownership rights and were largely excluded from participating in capitalist wealth accumulation. She made the crucial point that for much of history, women themselves were legally considered property.
That completely reframes it. It's not an innate lack of understanding, but a consequence of being denied ownership and participation.
Exactly. It shifts the explanation from inherent deficiency to historical inequality. But despite these powerful critiques, Lombroso's ideas, especially his underlying assumptions about women's biological nature, proved surprisingly sticky.
How did that influence continue if his main theory was discredited?
It often continued implicitly. Many later biological positivists kept focusing on female passivity and a supposed lack of aggression as the key reasons for women's lower crime rates. They might not have cited Lombroso directly on skull shapes, but the core idea of inherent female passivity persisted.
So the conclusions remain similar even if the specific evidence changed.
To some extent, yes. The source mentions studies like by Money and Earnhardt in 1972 or Rose, Holliday, and Bernstein in 1971 who were still proposing that female passivity was related to differences in brain structure or hormones. And they even drew on studies involving rats in cages to support these ideas about humans.
Using rat behavior to explain complex human social phenomena like crime. That seems like a bit of a stretch.
It certainly highlights the determination to find biological explanations. Of course, there were contrasting views. Behaviorists like J. Marsh mentioned in the source from 1978 argued forcefully that observed sex differences in behavior were purely the result of socialization, not biology.
So the classic nature versus nurture debate playing out specifically around gender and crime.
Absolutely. And the source concludes that even with all the research that followed, it's remained incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to definitively separate the influence of social factors versus genetic factors, or to fully understand how they interact to shape behavior.
It's a complex interplay. Okay, let's delve a bit deeper into biological positivism. The source talks about theories linking female crime specifically to biological changes during generative phases.
Yes, this is another really interesting and often quite controversial area within early biological explanations. These theories propose direct links between female offending and the biological changes associated with reproduction, particularly the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, and menopause.
Linking crime to periods or menopause, what was the core idea there?
The core idea, especially as applied to menstruation, was, well, quite extraordinary. It was suggested that at certain times in their cycle, women are somehow biologically reminded that they can't become men.
Reminded they can't become men.
Yes. And that this realization caused a kind of psychological distress that, in turn, made them more susceptible to committing offenses.
That feels like a huge interpretive leap from a biological process.
Mm-hmm.
Who are the main proponents of these kinds of ideas?
Otto Pollack, whose work we'll discuss more under psychological positivism, is a key figure here too. His 1950 book, The Criminality of Women, included these biological aspects. He talked about hormonal disturbances during pregnancy and menopause as potential causes of crime, and he definitely supported the idea linking menstruation to offending.
So Pollack bridged the biological and psychological explanations here. Were there actual studies trying to prove this link with the menstrual cycle?
There were. Dorothy Dalton's 1961 study is often cited. She studied imprisoned women and found that nearly 60%, 59.8% to be exact, had committed their offenses during what she identified as the 16-day period of pre- and post-menstrual hormonal imbalance.
Okay, nearly 60%. On the surface, that sounds potentially significant.
It does, and it got a lot of attention, but the source is very careful to highlight the other side of that statistic. 40.2% of the women in her study committed their crimes during the other 12 days of their cycle.
Right, so over 40% didn't fit the pattern.
Exactly. So while there might be some correlation for a majority in that specific study group, it's nowhere near a definitive causal link.
Yeah.
It doesn't explain the large minority who offended outside that period, and the results are ultimately considered inconclusive regarding causation.
Correlation doesn't equal causation, and it wasn't even universal correlation. Despite this scientific uncertainty, did the legal system ever actually accept these generative conditions as relevant?
Yes, remarkably, it did. In some jurisdictions and historical periods, these conditions have been accepted as mitigating circumstances in criminal cases involving women. Susan Edwards, writing in 1988, noted that premenstrual tension, or PMT, was actually discussed quite frequently as part of the defense narrative in 19th century cases of female violence, killing, arson, and theft.
Back in the 19th century. So this idea has very deep roots in legal thinking.
It really does. And Edwards, along with Anne Luckhouse, also pointed to cases from the early 1980s where PMT was successfully argued in mitigation, leading to significant outcomes like murder charges being reduced to manslaughter.
Reducing murder to manslaughter based on PMT, that's a major legal consequence. Is there even medical consensus that PMT is a clearly defined syndrome?
That's another layer of complexity. The source mentions that medical evidence on PMT as a distinct syndrome is actually divided. When effects are discussed, they're usually seen as primarily psychological things like increased tension, irritability, depression, tiredness, mood swings, perhaps loneliness.
Mainly psychological effects.
Mostly, although Dalton, back in 1984, did include some physical effects like epilepsy or fainting in her descriptions. Some researchers, like Rose in 2000, even suggested that women with these conditions should get early medical treatment specifically to prevent future criminal behavior, arguing this evidence was vital for courts.
Framing it as a treatable medical condition that predicts crime. What about the specific case of postnatal depression, or PND?
PND has a particularly unique status in criminal law, at least in some systems like the UK's. There is a specific partial defense known as infanticide.
Infanticide as a legal defense.
Yes. If a mother kills her child within the first year of its life, and the court determines that the balance of her mind was disturbed due to the effects of childbirth, postnatal depression, or even lactation, the charge can be reduced from murder to the lesser offense of infanticide.
That's a formally recognized defense in law.
It is. And the source highlights something absolutely critical here. This infanticide defense is only available to women. It's the sole sex-specific defense recognized in criminal law.
The only one tied specifically to one sex, based on biology and reproduction. That's really striking.
It powerfully underscores how deeply these biological and psychological explanations linked to female reproduction became embedded in the legal system's approach. But the source also rightly introduces alternative perspectives, such as pointing out that these tragic events, these killings of infants, could also stem from other profound stressors: extreme exhaustion from round-the-clock care, intense feelings of guilt or inadequacy if bonding is difficult, overwhelming social isolation or lack of support.
Factors beyond just hormones or PND itself.
Exactly. And crucially, the source points out that these factors, exhaustion, guilt, social pressure, could equally be experienced by a man who finds himself as the primary caregiver for an infant.
But a man in that exact situation wouldn't have access to the infanticide defense.
Correct. Research cited, like Marks and Kumar's from 1993, shows that while the rate of killing children under 1 has remained sadly constant, women who commit these acts are generally treated much more leniently by the justice system than men are, sometimes even when the violence used was greater.
So there seems to be a clear difference in how the system responds, based on gender, even beyond that specific defense.
It strongly suggests so. Dell noted back in 1984 that manslaughter sentences were generally getting tougher. But Merkatkin and Ogle suggested in 1993 that women convicted of manslaughter often following these kinds of cases frequently received probation. This points towards a level of judicial compassion or perhaps differential treatment rooted in assumptions about female fragility or diminished responsibility in these circumstances.
Compared to men who might commit similar acts under stress.
Yes, men typically received and still receive much harsher sentences. This brings us back to the broader implication the source draws out.
Which is?
While these legal allowances might provide some benefit or leniency to individual women in incredibly difficult situations, the very existence and application of these sex-specific defenses and the observed differential treatment reinforce that persistent, biologically positivist idea stretching all the way back to Lombroso.
The idea that women are somehow inherently less capable of controlling themselves.
Precisely. That their actions, especially violent ones in these contexts, are best explained by medical conditions, hormones, or reproductive functions, rather than potentially being understood as responses to dire socioeconomic circumstances, or even, in some cases, as rational, albeit horrific, choices made under extreme duress.
It medicalizes or pathologizes their behavior, removing agency.
Exactly. The consequence is that women in these situations are often framed as sick and needing treatment, rather than being seen as fully responsible agents whose actions might need to be understood within a broader social context. And as the source notes, similar conditions in men, like hormonal imbalances, rarely, if ever, influence their conviction or sentence. Different standards clearly apply.
That's a powerful illustration of how these old biological ideas can still shape legal realities. Okay, let's shift gears now towards psychological positivism.
Yeah.
W.I. Thomas is presented as a key transitional figure here.
Yes, W.I. Thomas's work is really interesting because he starts to move beyond purely biological explanations. His approach, especially in his earlier writings like Sex and Society from 1907, was more complex. It incorporated physiological factors, but also brought in psychological and even some sociological elements.
So a more layered approach.
More layered, yes. But the source is careful to point out that his theories were still fundamentally built upon implicit foundational assumptions about the biological and psychological nature of women that were heavily influenced by Lombroso and that whole tradition.
So still carrying some of that earlier baggage, even while adding new layers.
Exactly. In that 1907 work, Thomas explained the perceived inferior status of women largely through physiological assumptions. He argued men possess high levels of sexual energy driving them to pursue women, while women possess strong maternal feelings leading them to essentially exchange sex for domesticity and security within the family.
Exchange sex for domesticity. That sounds pretty blunt.
It was his framing of the underlying dynamic. He argued this biological difference led to women becoming domesticated, often viewed as male property, while men naturally took on leadership roles in society. As a result, he believed the behavior of men and women was regulated by very different social norms and legal expectations.
And how did this play out in terms of crime and the law, according to Thomas?
He argued that because women held this marginal position outside the home, particularly in the economic world, they also held a subsidiary position regarding contractual laws governing property and production. He thought they just weren't a threat to the commercial world, and so the legal system treated them more leniently when they committed property crimes.
More lenient for theft, for example.
Yeah.
But didn't you say earlier theories suggested the opposite for sexual behavior?
Precisely. Thomas echoed that distinction. While lenient on property crime, he argued the law was much stricter and more rigorous when it came to prosecuting women for perceived violations of sexual norms.
Okay, let's turn to his later, maybe more famous work, The Unadjusted Girl.
Right, from 1923. In this book, Thomas developed his theory of the 4 basic wishes or desires he believed were fundamental to all human nature. The desire for new experience, the desire for security, the desire for response, meaning affection, love, belonging, and the desire for recognition, status, prestige.
4 basic human wishes. Where do these come from?
He suggested they were derived from underlying biological instincts, things like anger, fear, love, and the will to gain power or status.
Okay, biological instincts fuel psychological wishes.
Yeah.
How did he connect this to gender and crime?
He argued that society, through socialization, channels these instincts and wishes towards gender-appropriate goals, and here's his specific claim about women. He believed that women have a naturally stronger desire stemming from the biological instinct of love compared to men.
Women are more driven by the need for love, for response.
That was his core psychological assertion for women, and he argued that it's precisely this intense need to give and receive love that leads women into crime, especially into sexual offenses like prostitution.
So prostitution isn't about money or lack of options, it's a misguided search for love.
That was Thomas's primary psychological explanation in this framework. However, the source really emphasizes an important way Thomas did depart from strict Lombrosian determinism.
How so?
While he saw wishes as driving behavior, he argued that socialization ultimately controls how these wishes are expressed. This meant that these fundamental drives could be channeled towards either socially acceptable ends or antisocial ones. It implied behavior wasn't fixed, it could potentially be changed or redirected.
So there's room for intervention, for rehabilitation, unlike impure biological determinism.
Exactly. It opened the door to the idea of rehabilitation. He actually wrote quite powerfully about this in The Unadjusted Girl.
What do you say?
He wrote, "There is no individual energy, no unrest, no type of wish, which cannot be sublimated and made socially useful. The problem is not the right of society to protect itself, but the right of the disorderly and antisocial person to be made orderly and socially valuable. The problem of society is to produce the right attitudes in its members."
The right of the disorderly to be made orderly.
Ah.
That does shift the focus towards societal intervention. But how did this translate in practice for criminal women?
The implication was that instead of just incapacitating supposedly predestined criminals, society should intervene to manipulate individuals, correct faulty socialization, especially in families from disadvantaged areas or slums, as he might put it, and instill the right attitudes.
Okay, but what about the social structures themselves? If a woman was dissatisfied with her limited roles,
That's the key limitation. The focus was squarely on changing her attitudes to fit the existing conventional sexual roles. It wasn't about questioning or transforming those roles themselves, which would have required a much broader social critique he wasn't offering. The problem was located within the unadjusted girl, not the society that might be limiting her.
so fix the individual woman, not the potentially problematic social expectations.
Precisely. He also applied a class lens, suggesting middle-class women committed little crime because they were well socialized to control their desires and valued chastity as a kind of investment for securing a good marriage and future security.
Chastity as an investment again. That market analogy seems persistent.
It does. He contrasted this with poor women, whom he described not as inherently immoral, but as amoral. He argued they weren't biologically driven to crime, but simply sought it out, motivated by the desire for excitement, for new experience, with little regard for middle-class notions of security tied to reputation.
So poor women seek excitement, middle-class women seek security through virtue.
That was his framing.
Yeah.
He literally used the analogy of women's virtue as capital. Good women kept their bodies as capital to exchange for marriage, while bad women traded their bodies for immediate thrills. Klein's critique, which we mentioned, called this astonishing, nay, obscene, especially considering the real poverty and hardship many women faced at the time Thomas was writing.
Obscene is strong. It really highlights how disconnected this psychological framing could be from economic reality.
It absolutely does. And the source makes the point that Thomas, just like Lombroso before him and others like Freud, Davis, and Pollack after him, essentially dismissed or ignored economic factors as a significant driver of female crime.
So even with psychological and social elements, the economic dimension remained largely invisible in his analysis of women's crime. Let's move on to Freud. His theories are famously rooted in biology, right?
Yes, Freudian theory's perspective on women and deviance is explicitly grounded in biological assumptions about women's inherent nature. His famous and highly controversial saying, "Anatomy is destiny."
Anatomy is destiny. That really sets the tone, doesn't it?
It certainly does. For Freud, women were seen as anatomically inferior to men, primarily due to lacking a penis, and this biological fact determined their supposedly inferior destiny as wives and mothers.
Inferiority based on anatomy. How did he develop that idea?
It stemmed from his theory of psychosexual development and the infamous concept of penis envy. He claimed that young girls, upon realizing they lack a penis, assume they must have lost it as a punishment. This, he argued, traumatizes them, leading them to grow up envious of men and potentially seeking revenge.
Penis envy as the root of female psychology.
In his model, yes. And boys, witnessing this supposed lack in girls, develop a corresponding castration anxiety, fearing female envy and vengeance. It's quite a psychodrama he constructs.
It is. And how did this concept of penis envy supposedly shape typical feminine traits?
According to Freud, many traits considered typically feminine were actually compensations for this perceived anatomical lack. He described women as exhibitionistic and narcissistic, suggesting these were attempts to make up for not having a penis by focusing intensely on their physical appearance, on being beautiful and well-dressed.
So interest in fashion or appearance is pathologized as penis envy compensation.
That was the Freudian interpretation. He also incorporated the idea of female masochism, which Lombroso and Thomas had also touched upon. Freud argued that a woman's role in sex is inherently receptive, and that her pleasure actually consisted of experiencing pain.
Pain is pleasure. That's a disturbing claim.
It is. He contrasted this with men who were seen as naturally aggressive and pain-inflicting in the sexual sphere. Millett discussed this critique extensively in 1970.
What about women's intellectual or social abilities in Freud's view?
Generally, he considered women intellectually and socially inferior to men. He believed they were inherently preoccupied with personal, private matters and lacked a genuine interest in or capacity for engaging with the wider public world, with civilization itself.
Why did he think that?
Freud argued that civilization is built upon the repression or sublimation of the powerful sex drive. He saw it as the specific duty of men with their strong instincts to undertake this repression in order to conduct the serious business of culture, science, and society.
So men build civilization by controlling their drives, but women can't or don't participate in that.
That was his view. He wrote quite explicitly in 1933 that women have little sense of justice, connected with the preponderance of envy in their mental life. He also said their actual interests are weaker than those of men, and that their capacity for the sublimation of their instincts is less.
Less capacity for sublimation. Can you unpack sublimation in this context?
Sublimation, in Freudian terms, is channeling basic drives, especially sexual ones, into higher, socially acceptable pursuits like art, science, or work. Freud believed men were capable of this because they were fundamentally rational and understood the need to control urges for the greater good of society.
And women weren't.
Women, in contrast, he saw as primarily emotional, governed by their instincts and envy, and therefore incapable of making the rational judgments needed for sublimation and full participation in the higher aspects of civilization.
So men are rational builders of society, women are emotional and stuck in the personal realm.
That's the essence of it. And the logical conclusion for Freud was that it was perfectly natural and appropriate for women to have only a marginal relationship to the world of production, property, and public life. Their place was determined by their nature.
These theories weren't just describing difference, they were actively justifying social inequality. How did Freud view the deviant woman?
The deviant woman in the Freudian schema was one who went against this perceived inherent nature. She was trying to be a man.
Trying to be a man. How would that manifest?
She would be seen as aggressive, rebellious, ambitious, but any drive for success or achievement she showed was simply interpreted as evidence of her unresolved penis envy.
So her ambition wasn't genuine, just a symptom of wanting a penis.
That was the psychoanalytic interpretation, and it was deemed a hopeless ambition, one that could only lead to neurosis and unhappiness. The only solution offered was therapy treatment to help her adjust and accept her natural, passive domestic sex role.
Deviance is illness, and the cure is conformity to the stereotype. Klein also commented on the wider societal impact of these Freudian ideas, didn't she?
Yes, Klein observed in 1973 that while Freud's core ideas, repression of instincts, female passivity, the sanctity of the nuclear family might have seemed conservative even in his own time, they became incredibly influential, almost achieving a dominant hegemonic status, particularly in the United States.
How did that influence play out practically?
Well, as Kate Millett argued in 1970, these Freudian concepts, combined with later work like Bowlby's, provided a powerful intellectual and cultural justification for pushing women back into the home after World War II.
When the economy didn't necessarily need their labor anymore.
Exactly. It helped rationalize the return to traditional gender roles. And this was significantly boosted by John Bowlby's maternal deprivation thesis, published by the UN in 1952.
The idea that children need their mothers constantly.
Yes, Bowlby argued that continuous close care, predominantly from the mother, during the early formative years, was absolutely essential for a child to grow into a well-adjusted, law-abiding adult. This gave a kind of official international stamp of approval to the idea that a mother's primary natural place was in the home caring for children.
So academic and psychological theories provided strong backing for the post-war domestic ideal.
They really did. And it's important to see how Freud's core concepts directly influenced other key writers on female deviance, like Kingsley Davis, Otto Pollack, and Gisela Konopka.
How did they build on Freud?
They explicitly used Freudian notions like sexual maladjustment and neurosis as primary explanations for why women commit crimes. They consistently defined healthy women in Freudian terms as naturally masochistic, passive, sexually indifferent, while casting criminal women as sexual misfits, women whose deviance stemmed from their failure to conform to this passive female sexual norm.
So crime becomes a symptom of failed femininity, specifically failed sexual passivity.
Precisely. And the critical point the source emphasizes here is that these writers relied almost exclusively on these psychological and sexual factors while virtually ignoring the potential role of socioeconomic factors, poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity in driving female crime.
Ignoring the context again, let's look closer at Kingsley Davis. His study to prostitution was mentioned as influenced by Thomas and Freud.
Yes, Davis's study on prostitution, first published in 1937 but influential through its 1961 republication, is a classic example of structural functionalism applied to deviance. And it was explicitly built on assumptions about the organic nature of man and woman that clearly echo Thomas and Freud.
Organic nature. Back to inherent biological differences driving social structures. What was Davis's main argument about prostitution?
Davis argued that prostitution wasn't just a social problem, but a structural necessity. He believed its foundations lay in the fundamental sexual nature of humans, particularly male sexual needs, and society's attempts to control them.
Hmm.
His conclusion was quite stark. Prostitution is universally inevitable.
Inevitable. Why?
Because, he argued, sexual repression is essential for social order. He was writing when legitimate sexuality was confined to the nuclear family, seen as crucial for stability. Davis argued that men naturally have strong sexual urges that society must control to maintain the family unit.
So society needs to repress male sexuality for stability.
Yes, but that repression creates a problem. Men still have sexual needs, unmarried men, married men seeking variety, men seeking acts their wives wouldn't perform. Prostitution, in Davis's functionalist view, served as a necessary outlet for these unsatisfied male desires, an outlet that didn't threaten the core institution of marriage.
So prostitution protects the family by providing a release valve for male sexuality.
That was his functionalist argument. He saw it as serving a societal purpose. He famously wrote about how men dominate women and view them as sexual property, making female promiscuity outside marriage deeply threatening to the social order based on male control.
So prostitutes were fulfilling a necessary, if degraded, social role in this model.
Exactly. And Davis viewed the prostitutes themselves not primarily as victims of circumstance or economic hardship, but as sexual transgressors, women acting outside the bounds of marital restraint. He argued there would always be a demand for their services as long as men sought women.
Did he think prostitution could ever be eliminated?
Not really. He was very pessimistic. He thought it could only disappear in a hypothetical society with total sexual freedom, no institutional control, and perfect mutual desire conditions he believed would never exist.
Why not?
Because the basic causes, institutional control of sex, inequalities in attractiveness, and crucially, economic and social inequalities between classes and sexes, he saw these as permanent features of society, unlikely ever to disappear.
It's interesting. He lists economic and social inequalities as causes, but then just accepts them as permanent.
Yes, it shows how functionalism can sometimes accept the status quo as inevitable. He argued that men who couldn't attract women for mutual pleasure or lacked the skills or inclination for courtship would always exist, sustaining the demand.
Okay, that's a demand side. What about the supply side? Why did Davis think women became prostitutes?
Davis argued they did it for two main reasons: good pay and sexual pleasure. He presented it as a functional system that ultimately benefited everyone involved.
Good pay and pleasure. So he completely dismissed economic coercion or lack of alternatives.
Entirely. He framed it as an autonomous individual choice made by women seeking these benefits. Klein pointed out this view aligns with Thomas's idea of the unadjusted girl seeking thrills, adjusting to her feminine role illegitimately rather than being a rebel like Lombroso's masculine offender.
But what was Davis's underlying psychological view of these women?
Despite arguing for its social necessity, Davis personally viewed women who chose prostitution as psychologically maladjusted and neurotic.
So society needs them, but they're individually sick for fulfilling that need.
Precisely. And this leads directly to Klein's sharpest critique. If prostitution is necessary and the women involved are inherently neurotic, then Davis's theory logically requires a permanently sick and maladjusted class of women for society to function, a requirement he seemed entirely unprepared to question.
That's a damning point. His theory necessitates pathology but doesn't challenge it. Let's move to Otto Pollack and his influential idea of hidden female crime.
Pollack's The Criminality of Women from 1950 was another hugely influential text in that post-war era. His central thesis was this concept of hidden or masked female crime. He proposed this specifically to explain the gap between the low official statistics for female crime and what he believed must be the much higher actual rate.
So he thought women were committing a lot more crime than anyone realized.
Yes, much more. And he argued that the reason for this hidden criminality lay in the inherent nature of women themselves. He saw women as naturally deceitful and manipulative, often acting as the instigators behind crimes rather than the direct perpetrators.
Naturally deceitful. What was his basis for that claim?
Well, Pollack did acknowledge that women's roles were partly shaped by society, but he insisted on an inherent physiological basis for female deceitfulness. He made this extraordinary comparison between male and female sexual experience.
What was the comparison?
He wrote that men can't fake an erection or orgasm, making their sexual response obvious. But women, he claimed, woman's body, however, permits such pretense. Lack of an orgasm does not prevent her ability to participate.
So the ability to potentially fake an orgasm makes women inherently deceitful in all aspects of life.
That was his leap in logic, reducing female nature to the sex act, much like Freud, and concluding they are inherently sly, manipulative, passive, and passionless. He even offered a second biological reason for this innate deceit.
Another one.
Yes. He argued that societal expectations force women to conceal menstruation every month, and that this regular act of concealment must condition them to a different attitude towards veracity than men.
Concealing menstruation teaches women to lie. That's quite a claim.
It seems incredibly far-fetched today. Pollack proposed a second factor contributing to this hidden crime. The traditional roles women occupied gave them unique opportunities for undetected crimes.
I just had.
As domestics, nurses, teachers, housewives, roles that gave them access and opportunity for things like theft, poisoning, or abuse that could easily go unnoticed or be hard to prove. Crimes of opportunity linked to their sphere.
Okay, opportunity linked to roles. Did he also link the types of crimes women commit to their supposed nature?
Yes. He saw things like false accusation as stemming from inherent female treachery, spite, or fear, which he viewed as signs of neurosis. Shoplifting, often statistically associated with women, he tended to attribute to kleptomania, framing it as a psychiatric disorder rather than an economic crime.
So again, female crime is pathologized. It's mental illness or inherent flaws, not rational action or response to circumstances.
Exactly. Pollack's explanation boils down to socio-psychological factors, highly personalized, viewing female crime largely as a product of individual mental illness, with economic conditions dismissed as virtually irrelevant. Now, his third major point was about why the crime rate appeared so low, the chivalry factor.
Ah, the idea that the justice system is chivalrous towards women.
Yes, building on Thomas's idea of differential treatment, Pollack argued that male-dominated society and its justice system, police, prosecutors, judges, juries, have a general protective attitude towards women. He wrote, "Men hate to accuse women, police officers dislike to arrest them, judges and juries to find them guilty, and so on."
So, men in the system supposedly let women off lightly, hiding the true extent of their crime.
That was Pollack's explanation for the low official numbers. But again, Klein's 1973 critique of this chivalry concept is devastating.
What did Klein argue against it?
Klein argued that this supposed chivalry is highly unlikely to be extended to the women who actually populate the criminal justice system, who are disproportionately poor, women of color, or white women who have drastically violated traditional norms.
So chivalry, if it exists, only applies to privileged women who rarely encounter the justice system anyway.
Exactly. Klein called chivalry a fundamentally racist and classist concept, rooted in the idea of protecting ladies a status only afforded to wealthy, white, conforming women. And these ladies, she pointed out, are the least likely group to ever need or receive chivalry from the police or courts.
That completely undermines the idea that chivalry explains the overall low conviction rates for the women who are being processed by the system.
It really does. It shows the concept is largely mythical when applied to the actual population of female offenders. Klein then makes a really important overarching point, identifying the unifying thread across almost all these biological and psychological positivist explanations.
What was that unifying thread?
Sexuality. She argued that female crime within these frameworks is almost always interpreted through the lens of sexuality or deviation from prescribed gender roles.
How so?
Masculine crime is always defined as violent, overt crime. Ladylike crime gets reduced to sexual offenses or pathologized acts like shoplifting, linked to sexual frustration. A woman couldn't win. If she committed violent crime, she was labeled masculine, explained by biological flaws, penis envy, or atavism. If she committed less aggressive crime while seemingly conforming, she was labeled manipulative, sexually maladjusted, or promiscuous.
So no matter the crime, the explanation always circled back to her biology, psychology, or sexuality, often ignoring the actual nature of the offense.
Precisely. The source emphasizes how this consistently overlooked the economic and social realities that most female offenders were poor, committing mainly property offenses. A woman's behavior had to be sexually defined to be understood. She only counted in the sexual sphere.
Even non-sexual crimes got sexualized explanations.
Yes. Campbell's 1981 observation about shoplifting is a prime example. Shoplifting by women, but not the majority committed by men, was often explained away by citing psychiatric issues linked to sexuality, seeking sexual excitement, appeasing desires, needing punishment for those desires.
Really stretching to avoid economic motives.
Absolutely. These explanations persisted, partly fueled by focusing on offenders who were single, divorced, or widowed, while ignoring the obvious economic vulnerability of these groups. The Gibbons and Prince 1962 study on shoplifting is also telling. They explained working-class male shoplifting using peer pressure, but for a small group of middle-class male shoplifters, they resorted to suggesting homosexual tendencies, applying the sexuality-based logic used for females to this outlier male group, perhaps to maintain consistency in their pathological framing.
So different standards clearly applied. Sexuality was the default explanation for women, but an exception needing justification for men.
It points to a deep bias. As the source summarizes, female crime was almost always explained as a breach of dominant gender norms, sometimes justifying harsher treatment. Clinical and sexual explanations were readily accepted for women, even without evidence, while similar explanations for male crime were largely rejected, even when relevant. Different standards prevailed.
That's a crucial summary of the bias inherent in these early positivist approaches to women. Okay, let's shift now to sociological positivism. Did these theories do a better job?
Well, this section examines how well major sociological positivist theories from Merton, Cohen, Cloward, and Olin, Sutherland, Parsons apply to female criminality. The general observation, noted by scholars like Eileen Leonard, is that even though these theories often claim to be general explanations of crime,
They were mostly based on studying men.
exactly, they tended to be, implicitly or explicitly, explanations of male behavior patterns, and they often seem to have very little relevance or applicability when you tried to use them to understand why women commit crimes or why they commit so much less crime than men.
Developed for men, poor fit for women. Let's start with Robert Merton's anomie theory. That's a big one in sociology.
Hugely influential. Merton tried to offer a comprehensive sociological explanation for crime, arguing that the social structure itself pressures people into nonconformity.
The strain between goals and means, right?
That's the core idea. He argued American society places huge emphasis on cultural goals, especially financial success, but doesn't provide equal legitimate means for everyone to achieve those goals. This creates strain, particularly for lower classes, leading some to use illegitimate means, what he called innovation, to get ahead.
Did he ever modify that?
He did refine it. He acknowledged wealth wasn't the only goal, and even the rich could feel pressure to innovate, always wanting more. He talked about other adaptations like ritualism, and importantly, he later acknowledged that power structures influence who gets labeled deviant and punished differently based on class, race, etc.
So he added some nuance. But how did he apply it to women?
And here's the kicker the source highlights.
Yep.
He didn't. Merton made no attempt to apply his theory of anomie to women. He completely ignored female criminality in his framework.
Just left half the population out.
Essentially, yes. And as Eileen Leonard critiqued, the theory doesn't even seem easily applicable at first glance. She questioned whether monetary success was even the dominant cultural goal for most women, especially back then.
What did she suggest women's goals were?
Building on earlier work by Ruth Morris, she argued women and girls were primarily socialized to value and aim for successful relationships, marriage, children more than careers, and financial gain in the way men traditionally were.
Different primary goals mean the strain Merton talked about might operate differently or not at all.
Exactly. Leonard suggested that maybe achieving goals related to family actually insulated many women from the specific type of anomic pressure men faced from career or financial failure. She did concede that perhaps anomie could help explain rising female crime rates more recently, if women's goals are shifting more towards traditional male goals, thus exposing them to similar strains.
So, if women face the same goal means gap, anomie might apply.
Potentially. But the source points out a big flaw in that argument, too. It assumes all women share the same goals. It ignores how class, race, ethnicity shape women's aspirations and experiences differently, as scholars like Ladner, Anderson, and Collins have shown. Anomie theory focuses on common goals, not these crucial variations.
It's too monolithic, ignores intersectionality.
Precisely. And Leonard also argued anomie just seems inappropriate for the types of crime women typically commit. How does innovation using illegal means help achieve the goal of marriage or family? Theft or prostitution aren't really alternatives to finding a husband. Plus, many convicted women are already married with kids.
So the core mechanism doesn't fit their likely goals or circumstances.
It's a really poor fit. The source concludes anomy theory fails to explain why women deviate the way they do, or what specific strain leads to their offending. It's largely a theory about men and money, ignoring gender and other social variations. Examining women reveals its fundamental flaws, showing Merton's common goals weren't so common after all.
A supposedly general theory proving very male-specific. What about theories focusing on deviant subcultures?
These theories were also central to sociological explanations, focusing on differential socialization, but again, the focus was overwhelmingly on urban working-class male delinquency. Albert Cohen, in his 1955 book Delinquent Boys, is a prime example.
What was Cohen's take on gender?
Cohen explicitly argued that boys and girls face different core problems. Boys are concerned with status and achievement compared to other males. Girls, he argued, are primarily concerned with their relationships with males.
So different central anxieties based on gender roles.
Yes. Now, Cohen didn't claim this was purely natural, like the biological positivist, but he did propose that girls find their main fulfillment through relationships with the opposite sex. His conclusion: the adjustment problems leading to delinquent gangs are fundamentally male problems.
And the delinquent subculture itself is therefore irrelevant for girls.
Exactly. He argued the typical delinquent subculture focused on toughness, non-utilitarian destruction, defying authority, was completely inappropriate for addressing what he saw as female needs and anxieties.
So what did explain female delinquency for Cohen?
He suggested a girl's peace of mind depended on feeling sexually attractive and securing good relationships. Therefore, he saw female sexual delinquency promiscuity perhaps as one possible response to this central female problem of relationship building.
Sexual delinquency is a way to solve relationship problems. That seems counterintuitive.
Leonard critiqued this strongly, pointing out it's unclear how sexual delinquency actually helps establish stable relationships. Plus, Cohen's theory doesn't explain why most women who don't have successful relationships still don't commit crime.
Another theory failing to explain both offending and conformity. What about Walter Miller and his focal concerns?
Miller, writing in 1958 about lower-class culture, made literally no attempt to consider female crime. His focal concerns, trouble, toughness, smartness, excitement, fate, autonomy, were presented as general lower-class values, but if they applied equally to women, crime rates should be similar. They seem overwhelmingly male preoccupations.
So another major sociological theory that just ignores women. What about differential opportunity theory from Cloward and Olin?
This one seems potentially more promising for gender because it explicitly considers access to both legitimate and illegitimate opportunities.
How could that explain lower female crime?
Simply by arguing women have far less access to illegitimate opportunities, criminal networks, skills, chances to commit crime compared to men, as Harris suggested in 1977. Cloward himself acknowledged women were often excluded from criminal activities, though he thought class was more important than gender in differentiating opportunity.
So fewer chances to be bad, even if they wanted to.
That's the potential application. Research by Morris, Campbell, and others confirmed girls often lack the subcultural support for delinquency that boys have. But while Cloward and Olin added the useful dimension of illegitimate opportunity,
There's a but.
yes, Leonard critiqued them for ignoring societal reactions, failing to explain crime among successful women, and most fundamentally for not questioning why these profound gender differences in opportunities and expectations exist in the first place. They described the difference, but didn't explain its origins.
Accepting the structure without analyzing its roots again. Okay, let's look at Sutherland's differential association theory and related sexual theories.
Edwin Sutherland's theory is foundational. Crime is learned behavior, like any other skill, through interaction with others. You become criminal, essentially, by associating more with people who favor law-breaking than with people who favor law-abiding.
Learn through your social circle.
Yeah.
How does this apply to the gender gap in crime?
The argument is that if girls' primary social environment historically was the restrictive family, they were simply less exposed to criminal patterns than boys who had more freedom. Cohen, Linda Smith, and Schuessler pointed this out. Girls often lacked contact with gangs or other groups where criminal attitudes and techniques are learned.
Less exposure, less learning of criminal ways.
Exactly. And even within the family, girls were often supervised more closely and taught conforming attitudes more consistently than boys. Sutherland himself said the key difference was probably that girls are supervised more carefully and taught anti-criminal patterns more rigorously.
So closer supervision and more pro-law messages shield girls from crime.
That's the differential association explanation. They encounter more anti-criminal definitions for longer periods. Sutherland even tentatively linked this back to biology, suggesting pregnancy necessitated greater female supervision. This learning approach fits well with sex role theories popular in the mid-20th century.
What did sex role theories argue?
They argued proper socialization aligns with biological sex. Males become masculine, females become feminine. Female crime occurs when this natural process fails, when women don't properly adopt the passive, gentle, dependent, motherly role.
Deviance has failed femininity again. How did Talcott Parsons fit in?
Parsons, a major sociologist, used the typical mid-century family structure, dad works, mom at home, to explain differing crime rates. Boys, identifying with the absent father in the competitive world, learn to reject passive good boy behavior, fostering aggression, potentially leading to delinquency.
So masculinity itself could lead boys towards deviance.
That was Parsons' implication. Girls, conversely, had the mother as a constant role model, allowing them to mature emotionally and embrace conforming femininity. Others built on this. Grosser said boys pursue power, money, theft, while girls pursue relationships, sexual delinquency, or theft of makeup to attract boys.
Even sociological theories kept linking female crime back to relationships and appearance.
Often, yes. Rice talked about girls seeking prestige through relationships with boys. Hoffman-Bustamante argued boys learn rule-breaking can pay off, while girls learn only conformity is rewarded. Sex role skills were even thought to dictate crime types, women using household implements, not weapons.
Did research support these links between femininity, masculinity, and crime type?
Later research complicated it. Studies found little link between masculinity traits and female property violent crime, but did find women were more likely to be aggressive if perceived as less feminine. More recent work also highlights the family not just as a source of conformity, but sometimes as a place where women learn crime or experience violence themselves.
So the picture became more complex than these early theories suggested. What about changes over time?
Cressy noted way back in 1964 the sex ratio was changing. He predicted that as women's social positions became more like men's, more education, employment, independence, the crime gap would shrink. Factors like urbanization and more broken families also played a role.
Social change leading to change in crime patterns.
Exactly. More recently, Giordano and Rockwell revisited differential association, suggesting it's key. They argued many women face hardship but don't offend. The crucial factor is early, close association with family members who model and approve of deviant lifestyles. Learning theory remains powerful.
Learning deviance within the family itself.
Yes. The source concludes this section by noting the massive shift from the dependent housewife model. Women now face huge economic pressures as breadwinners, often in precarious jobs. Box argued this increased strain might explain recent rises in female crime, especially property crime linked to poverty like TV license evasion.
So changing roles bring new pressures that might drive crime.
Potentially. But the source reiterates the crucial point. Despite all these changes, women still commit substantially less crime than men overall. That fundamental gap persists.
So bringing all these positivist approaches together, biological, psychological, sociological, what's the overall conclusion from the source material?
The source stresses that, scientifically speaking, none of the tests mentioned have conclusively proven or disproven a direct biological or psychological link to criminal behavior for either sex.
So no definitive scientific knockout punch either way, based on the evidence discussed.
That's the careful position taken. So while many of these theories seem nonsensical or deeply sexist to us now and have been heavily criticized, they can't be dismissed solely on the basis of the scientific tests presented here lacking definitive proof. That said, the trend has clearly been away from biology.
Towards social explanations.
Yes, towards socialization and environment, arguing these accentuate any small or non-existent biological differences. Biological arguments generally lack credibility now. Sociological ones seem more plausible on the surface.
But did the sociological theories actually succeed in explaining female crime?
The source concludes they largely failed too. They didn't provide convincing explanations for why women do commit crime, or perhaps more importantly, why they're generally so much more conforming than men.
Why did they fail, according to the source?
Possibly because, as Heidenson suggested, criminology traditionally saw male crime as the norm. Female crime was an afterthought, an anomaly.
If male crime is the standard, female crime gets misinterpreted.
Exactly. Studies implicitly based on masculinity, assuming a male offender, inevitably end up viewing women's behavior through a distorted male stream lens. Their unique experiences get forced into a male framework.
A fundamental bias in the very way the questions were asked.
It seems so. The source does mention these issues are revisited later in the book from a feminist perspective, which starts from a completely different place.
Something to look forward to. Now, for listeners who want to explore these early theories and critiques further,
The source recommends Klein's 1973 work and Leonard's 1983 work as really excellent, enduring feminist critiques that give a great overview of how positivism tackled or failed to tackle female crime.
good critical starting points.
And if you want to read the original theorists themselves, the source suggests Lombroso's work, like the 1920 English version, for biological ideas, Thomas's The Unadjusted Girl, 1923, and Pollack's The Criminality of Women, 1950, for the psychological parameters, and Talcott Parsons' writings, 1947-1954, for the classic, if dense, sociological take on sex roles and the family.
Plenty there for you to dig into if specific ideas caught your interest.
Definitely.
Well, this has been a fascinating, if sometimes uncomfortable, journey through early criminology's attempts to explain female offending. It really lays bare how social assumptions shaped scientific theories.
It absolutely shows how the lens we use shapes what we see, or what we think we see.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to consider, building on everything we've discussed today. How might that persistent historical tendency we saw, the tendency to link female crime primarily to biological nature or psychological maladjustment, rather than exploring socioeconomic factors or rational choice? How might that legacy continue to subtly shape how we perceive and respond to women involved in the criminal justice system today, even though the specific theories themselves have evolved?
It's a really pertinent question. Think about how female offenders are portrayed in the media, how they are sentenced, what rehabilitation programs focus on. The echoes of Lombroso, Freud, or Pollack still linger.
Something important to keep in mind. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you.